I hereby open the session. Please be seated. I would like to welcome you all to this PhD defense and introduce the members of the promotion committee to you. We have 5 opponents this afternoon. Professor Dr. Kirana Jaya from the University of Gadjah Mada, Indonesia, Professor Evje Kuppen, Leiden University, and the professors Kai Otsuki, A.J. Bailey, and Koen Franken from Utrecht University. Madam Doctoral Candidate, the Board of the Conferral of Doctoral Degrees of Utrecht University now grants you the opportunity to defend your dissertation in public. I would like to give the floor to the first opponent, which is Professor Dr. Kirana Jaya from Indonesia. You are muted.
Candidate.
Oh, yes. Please, go ahead.
Dear candidate, congratulations on finally completing your PhD thesis. Your work on contestation, conflict, and crisis in transition, the embedded of ride-sharing in Indonesia, is a significant contribution to our understanding of urban mobility transition, particularly in the context of Global South. As a professor of institutional economics, I'm very interested in your dissertation. Especially, I'm also staff in economic affairs, transportation investment for Minister of Transportation Indonesia. I've found your insight particularly relevant to our current challenges. Your work in Chapter 5 provides a comprehensive analysis of the dynamic between formal, informal institutions, strategic institutional work, and their policy implications. In this chapter, you delve into the interplay between crisis, digital platform, and informal institutions during the COVID-19 pandemic. My question is, how did the pandemic reshape the institutional landscape for ride-sharing services in Indonesia? Please.
Hooggeachte opponent, I appreciate your questions on the discussions of informal and formal institutions. I think this thesis, especially in Chapter 5, I discuss about the role of crisis, especially COVID-19 crisis, as an external force for mobility landscape, and to what extent this crisis shape the ride-sharing transitions in Indonesia. And to answer your questions, how this crisis shape the informal and formal institution, I have 2 points. The first one is that we need to be aware during the COVID-19 crisis, especially with the physical distancing policies, it creates a lot of limitation for ride-sharing services. The demand of ride-sharing services has been significantly reduced, and it has created financial challenge, especially for the drivers. In that sense, in Chapter 5, I mobilized institutional work analysis to unpack strategies that is employed by ride-sharing companies as well as drivers in order to respond to this crisis. And what I found is that they use strategies. One of important or significant strategies is on framing strategies. I think I will go to my second point on the framing strategies, which I think I identified that both ride-sharing companies and drivers community are trying to frame ride-sharing drivers as the pandemic hero, meaning that their services are very essential and necessary to fulfill the needs for those who are working from home. And in that sense, this new framing of pandemic hero has bridged the gap of legitimacy and legality of ride-sharing during crisis. So in that sense, I think the crisis somehow has mobilized or has created institutional work strategies that is employed by all of these multi-stakeholders in order to bridge the gap between what is legitimate and what is legality. And I think this is very much aligned with the way we understand about formal and informal institutions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, institution is formal, informal, including enforcement. Yeah. Your chapter also highlight. This is my second question. Your chapter also highlight the role of digital platform and social media in facilitating institutional work. Can you discuss how these tools were used during the pandemic and their potential for shaping the future urban mobility strategy in Indonesia, please?
In terms of role of social media, I think I also have 2 points to elaborate. The first one, I found out during these studies how the role of social media like Facebook, Twitter, and also WhatsApp group are very much essentials in first of all, the role in creating coordinations and also rapid communications in terms of physical distancings. And one important role I found is that social media helps this driver community and ride-sharing companies to advocate their strategies, to advocate their ideas. And in second point, beside how social media helps to advocate the frames of the drivers community, it also helps to unpack marginalized voice, which is especially those from informal workers like the drivers community. With this social media, it allows more alternative voice to be heard and get attentions to the government, and then it's become opportunity to change the policies. And for your last questions on the future of social media, I think from this learning from the COVID-19 crisis, we can see, at least in Indonesian context, the role of social media is now gaining very much prominence, meaning that governing transitions also should take into account the public discourse and a lot of contestation that happen in social media and treat it as equal and also a space for allowing marginalized voice to be heard.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Chief, I'll back you the leaders. Thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Jaya. The discussion will now be continued by Professor Ifjekupen from Leiden University.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate. Oh, dear candidate, yes? Can you hear me? Maybe
Yes.
the first question.
Yes.
I would like to compliment you on your beautiful thesis. I really enjoyed reading it. I liked your empirical focus, the focus on ride-sharing in Indonesia and the Philippines. And I also liked your conceptual and methodological approach. And I think especially at the time of conducting your studies and the moment of publishing some of the chapters of your thesis, this topic of digital platforms in relation to transitions was also rather new. And this, in combination with this focus on Indonesia and informal institutions, I think makes this thesis very valuable and interesting. Of course, I also have some questions for you. I would like to start with a question about chapter 4, which is about the methodology you use there, multi-criteria mapping. The results of your study show that stakeholders are not autonomous in developing their future storylines. So they develop their storylines in interaction with and also shaped by those of others, and particularly powerful others. The aim of your study was to open up the future storyline space around urban mobility in Indonesia. And I'm wondering, to what extent did you actually manage to diversify or pluralize future storylines? Didn't you structure and reproduce existing storylines rather than identify new storylines? So I was thinking you could have reflected, for instance, on the storylines that you have identified and compare them, for instance, with the dominant discourse on urban mobility to derive some conclusions on the newness of the storylines that you have identified. I was missing this a bit in the chapter, so maybe you could say something about it. Do you agree that indeed you did not really open up, but rather structure and identify existing storylines? And maybe I should specify, maybe I should even specify it more, because then the question is multi-criteria mapping as a method, is it actually a suitable method to open up this future space? Or maybe it helps to describe the existing future space.
Okay. Okay. Hoogleraar de opponent. To answer your questions, I have 3 points on the use of multi-criteria methods in Chapter 4, which I think the main idea of Chapter 4 is continuations for Chapter 3 and Chapter 2, of course, but then the idea is that in Chapter 3 I discuss about how conflict was being, how the complexity of conflict is being unpacked, and then I reflect that the empirical situations of this conflict of ride sharing is very much complex and multi-layers. And the idea for Chapter 4 is that how can we have a bit of more sort of intervention by discussing the futures of storylines and trying to unpack how many storylines of the future were there. So I think to answer your questions on why do I use multi-criteria mappings, to the best of my knowledge, these MCM tools, the idea is not to find out any representations of sample population, but the idea is how these MCM tools can open up different perspective or diversity of perspective. And in order to do that, I've taken into account what I've been doing in my research a few years back by understanding actors' background and also actors' perspective, and that informed me to have pretty much purposive selection of interviewee that I integrate in these studies. And then your first question on how do I pluralize storylines. It is
not how, but did you actually open up? Did you come up with new storylines, or did you rather identify those that were already there, but structure them and make them visible or discussable?
Yes, I did both actually. So I came up with already prepare storylines from my side, and these storylines were actually some kind of my analysis, preliminary analysis of what is existing storylines on the future of ride sharings. However, during this MCM interview, what I like is that these tools, this is a web-based tools, these tools allow me to also give a chance for other interviewees to give new storylines which they think has not been included in my previous storylines. I think in that sense, MCM is helping me to bridge this pluralization by giving me a chance opportunity to give the already prepared storylines from my side, but this is also allows different kind of storylines to be accounted. As you can see in figure 4.2 and in page 118, the first 3 storyline was the core storylines that I prepared at the beginning, and I was asking each of these interviewees to what extent do you agree with the storylines. And before we move on to the next step, discussing about the criteria, I also give them opportunity to, do you have any other storylines that you think also matters? And I think the result, we have 4 additional storylines. In the sense, at least I would say it's a bit of evidence that this is the way I pluralize the future storylines.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask a second
Yes,
question?
there is
Yeah.
time for another question.
Then I would like to ask you a question about your conclusion in chapter 6, where you state that it can be reflected that ride-sharing is driving a transformative shift in urban mobility, reshaping transportation paradigms and fostering more connected and user-centric approach. And after reading your thesis, I'm not sure if I agree with that conclusion. So I would like to challenge you a bit on that. So I was thinking, well, is it a transformation of the urban mobility system? I would say it is not a transition of the urban mobility system, but a change in the way OJEC mobility is organized, from informal to platform-based, and thereby maybe more formal even. As you explain in your thesis, ride-sharing was there already for a long time in Indonesia, and I'm not convinced that it is driving a shift, which would mean it would be the independent variable in your argumentation, but the way it is organized is the shift, so the dependent variable in your argument. So my question would be, what evidence do you have for claiming that transportation paradigms have been changed and that indeed ride-sharing is driving this transformative shift?
Okay. So I think in terms of the effect, I would say the ride-sharing effect is not only on how it creates new mode of transportation, because I also agree with you, this is just the same type of public transportation, whether it's car taxis or motorbike taxis. But I think the difference is that there is embeddedness of digital innovation into the process of this organizing mobility transition. And that is the thing that I discussed in this thesis, because I think it could work both sides. On the first side is, usually we understand digital platform only work on the online sectors without necessarily change the physical sectors. And the other side, usually we know transportation only work on physical sector, but not so much in online sectors. So I think by taking into account this case of ride-sharing in Indonesia, we might have an opportunity to further reflect to what extent these digital innovations will maybe disrupt or maybe transform the mobility transitions. Maybe this thesis is only discussing about ride-sharing, but right now in Indonesia and also maybe in other countries, there are different types of transportations service that also facilitate by digital innovation. So I hope that this particular study can have a bit of information of how do we have a bit of trajectory on the mobility transition as a whole.
Okay, so should I take this answer as, well, I'm not sure, but just to check, do you agree then indeed that this is not an urban mobility system transition, but indeed a change in the way, in this case, OJEC mobility is organized? Is this, so do you agree with me, or I'm still not...
I think the way I...
If you don't, please explain.
With a short answer, please.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, of course.
Short answer, please.
Okay, I think I would say that this ride-sharing cases is a beginning of further change on the mobility transition, because the change here is how digital innovation now goes to transportation sectors as well.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Kuppen. I would like to give the floor now to Professor Kei Otsuki from Utrecht University.
Dear candidate, I also enjoyed reading your book, especially the topic of contestations, conflicts, become drivers of transitions, or any development. Actually, I come from development studies. I love contestations and conflicts. So it's really good to read, also in the transition studies, and this also makes us think about particular context and conditions in which such conflicts are allowed to happen. So I thought it was great, actually, that people protesting, there are a lot of negotiations. And in that sense, it is good, to know that, such moments are receiving lots of attention when we indeed think about this kind of transitions. Now, one thing, so my first question is indeed what you describe as contestations and conflicts are pretty much in between new sort of drivers of Gojek and Grab drivers and Bluebird taxi drivers and other stakeholders in the government and companies and so on, but not so much within the drivers community or within the communities of digital Gojek, for example, or Grabs. And I'm asking, do you have any thoughts about how drivers themselves in this emerging community of platform, transportation platform economy are actually benefiting from the conflicts, or how different groups maybe or sections of the drivers will lose out, how much actually is beneficial, this new economy, because one of the quotes, you show that some drivers are really getting into this platform economy and now cannot get out anymore. It's like a drug addiction. And I think it's very important to think about the future or well-being or rights of this new huge amount of laborers that you have in Indonesia. Can you reflect on that first?
Well, hooggelerende opponent. I appreciate that you take into account and highlight the drug addict metaphor, because I think that is also one of important metaphor I found. So, so to answer your questions, I have 2 points on discussing about the driver community. I think one of the big stories on driver community came on chapter 3, where I discuss about the battleground of ride-sharing's governance. And I think in that analysis, I get benefit by using critical moment as the unit analysis, because these critical moments allow me to move away from binary logic of understanding conflict only between companies or drivers, because in reality, when I did the field work, conflict also happened within drivers' community. They have multiple perspectives there. So using this critical moment analysis allow me to unpack what are the discourse that employed by each of this community and how it is played out through the dramaturgy analysis. And I think in chapter 3, even though I would say that this is not a very large studies on driver community, but the metaphor of drug addictions, I would say, still stands still to at least giving us a different understanding and even much more closer understanding to how, not only how they live their life as a driver, but also how they feel about their life. And then for the second point is that I took also benefit from chapter 4 on the MCM analysis, because I also took into account driver perspective in this multi-criteria mapping. So in this mapping, actually, there are sort of perspective from the driver community as well. And one of the evidence is that on table 4.3 on page 120, that is one of, I think I would very much grateful for the result, because this is the result from diverse of perspective, from dominant actors or even marginal actors, that allow me to conclude 19 criteria in governing ride sharing. One important reflection I got is that from these 19 criteria, only 4 that actually discuss technical aspect of ride sharing, which means I think this finding give more space to social and economy and government regulations issues, which are actually, I think, also one of the main concern from the drivers, because drivers want to have a better and stable working conditions.
In the previous colleagues' exchange, you also mentioned those voices of drivers pretty active in social media. Maybe also, right, that they can share. And I'm actually interested when we really think about then the change in the labor governance of it. Do you see any roles or how drivers' organization actually works? Because you mention it, but I don't read it that much, or it makes me feel like, how does this association, or does it work as a trade union, or is it just another organization that, you know, they can raise voices but doesn't essentially change that much? How does it work in Indonesia?
Okay. I appreciate that. Of course, the stories about drivers, how they organize themselves, are somehow teased out in several chapters in this thesis. But I also agree that there is not one specific chapter that actually discussing about driver organization, which I think that is a very interesting future avenues for further research. But I think from each of these chapter, they have a bit of teasing out how drivers are actually organize themselves and what are their roles. Like, for example, in chapter 3 on critical moments analysis, there we can see that drivers himself mobilize material and non-materials aspect to voicing out their voice, like taking the protest into the street, but also at the same time making sure that the protest is non-violent, because they learn from previous driver organization, when you create protests with violence, it will only backfires. And then this kind of mobilization of protests and then conflict somehow was the one that became an important factor in creating critical moments. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it is in critical moment 2 in that chapter. And in this chapter 4, when I discuss about multi-criteria mapping, we see that driver organization also have different criteria which we have to take into account. But yes, unfortunately, as what Prof. Ivo mentioned before, there is sort of bounded imaginaries right now that happens between the drivers community and the policymakers, which maybe we are discussing about different power relations here. But I think that will be another interesting questions to also further pursue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Otsuki. The discussion will now be continued by Professor A.J. Bailey.
Great, thank you. Dear candidate, my compliments to you and to your supervisors as well on this very engaging thesis and innovative use of methods. The thesis makes a unique contribution to the literature on urban mobility transitions, especially from a Global South perspective. I'm impressed with the range of methods and theories and the way that you've combined these different concepts, especially in relation to showing ride-hailing or ride-sharing in Indonesia. My question actually interestingly follows from your last part of talking about bounded imaginaries. So I find the concept quite interesting, and I want to go deeper to find out. You report now on bounded imaginaries of the driver communities and that of the policymakers. What I miss is, where are the users in this process? What are their imaginaries? How are their imaginaries bounded? And what role do you see them playing in this sustainability transition?
Hogler, the opponent, in terms of users, I agree with you. This is also a very important perspective, and I also include a perspective of users in this chapter by interviewing the organization, if I'm not mistaken, from Masyarakat Transportasi Indonesia or Indonesian Transportation Societies, and they're also giving their criterias and also their desirable futures. And to answer your questions, to what extent they also have these bounded imaginaries or not in compared to the drivers community, I would say, I think I also wrote it somewhere in these chapters, I would say that they have a bit of more unbound imaginaries in compared to the drivers community, because in this chapter I argue that bounded imaginaries came from multiple social interactions between one actors to another. Like for drivers, I interviewed drivers that usually going to protest and also sit on the same room with the policymakers. So these multiple interactions does shape their imaginaries. But for the users' imaginations, I interviewed the representative of Indonesian Transport Society, which have a bit of much more helicopter views.
May I interject that
Yes.
these are still elite participants, right? The users who actually use this on daily basis. How do you see their imaginaries?
How do I see? So, yes, thank you very much. This is something that part of the limitation of the thesis, but I think I've been users myself and also observing some users as well. I think they are much more free because their main interactions or the main informations on understanding ride sharing came from public media rather than a direct interactions to the policymakers. So in that sense, maybe it is bounded imaginaries, but in a different context with the bounded imaginary that I mentioned here between the drivers and the policymakers. Maybe this is a very speculative of me, but I think it's a very interesting questions also to further research, is that maybe there is a different, bigger narrative like lock-in or path dependencies narrative that are influencing the imaginations of the users.
Ask a follow-up question.
You can continue.
In chapter 5, you discussed the role of conflict and crisis, and I found the discussion also very interesting. But coming from India, my observation is that in many of the countries in the global south or in the Asian countries, that this conflict and contestation are spaces where innovations take place as an outcome of not being able to set into these systems, right? So I would like your observation, having done this research, that these conflicts are constantly sustained to limit the regulatory power of the state. And in this way, these private companies can prosper or can get a greater market share because of the sustained conflict. Would you agree or not agree on this thing, and how do you see it in the Indonesian case?
Okay, thank you. I think to answer your questions, that the sustained conflict are actually, in a way, I see that from these studies, I learned that better or more inclusive governance of transitions are governance that take into account contestation and conflict as the process of transition and see it as a self-organized participations, which I think this is the context in global south countries because usually there are not so many space to voicing out marginalized perspective. And to answer your questions on the companies, I think of course it might be challenge for the company in facing sustained conflict, but I would argue that the company also should take into account this conflict because conflict allow us to understand alternative voices, nuanced perspective. Then once we avoided conflict or once we reject conflict, we just only stays in our echo chamber.
And the role of the state in this process?
I think the role of the state, I mentioned it was, I think if I'm not mistaken, in chapter 3, when I discussed the first critical moment where actually there is a protest between conventional taxis and the online taxis. And that was actually a critical moment where many storylines were played out, but unfortunately the government did not take that into account, and in consequence, the government need to revise the regulations 4 times in 2 years in creating a lot of works for them. So I think my main lesson I wrote there is that what if the government take into account the multiple perspective that happens in a conflict situation? It might give a more inclusive and also a more democratic process of governing this ride sharing.
I'm happy to see you have such a positive approach towards this, but thank you.
There is time for a last question.
Okay. Yes, thanks a lot. I have a very interesting next one. I think it's interesting, but maybe not. There is a lot of discussion of the new capital that's coming up in Indonesia. So what, based on this very interesting research that you've done, what recommendations would you make for the new city, for the new capital that's coming up? What kind of urban mobility infrastructures or changes or sustainable urban mobility infrastructures would you recommend for the capital city, for the new capital city?
Okay. I have 2 recommendations, maybe. But this is a recommendation that I take into account on my studies of ride sharings for the last 6 years. The first recommendations would be that to take into account contestations and conflict of IKN and take it very seriously, not only see it as someone critical and you want to bring them to jail, but really listen to this different voice, especially the marginalized voice, because all voices matters, including their voices. So in order to do that, I would recommend several methodologies that I use in this thesis, including MCM as well as understanding critical moments of each of these contestations. And my second point is that I think the concept of new capital city was also a concept of sustainable solutions or sustainable transitions from the problem that we have in existing capital cities. So then, of course, the hope is that we don't take a new problem from, we don't give new problem from this concept of solution by giving capital cities. And in order to realize that, I think we also need to take into a more inclusive dialogue, especially regular dialogue, and listen much more to the scholars, Indonesian scholars who are having expertise on sustainability, because I think these scholars on sustainability in Indonesia, they have invested their times and energy to understand what are actually the risks and the opportunity of creating this new capital city. So I hope that's still not in between positive and negative for you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Also, thank you, Professor Bailey. I would like to give the floor now to the last opponent, which is Professor Koen Frenken. Please.
Dear candidate, I also read your thesis with a lot of interest. I think it's a major contribution to the field of transition studies, bringing in the digital platform perspective, bringing in informal work perspective, and also bringing Indonesia into the picture. And in your conclusion chapter, you state that you had to deal with the challenge posed by the introduction of mobility solutions that are shaped following preferences and institutions of the global north, notably digital platforms, into Indonesia's transportation landscape. And one may add is that another perhaps challenge has been that you also applied theoretical frameworks from the global north in your own study. So what does this teach you about the Eurocentrism of transition studies?
Okay, the opponent. In answering your questions to the global north, by the way, I'm happy that you also appreciate Indonesia, and I hope it still it's their positions in the map of transitions. So in answering your questions, the framework of Global North, in the sense, I think the way I understand Global North and Global South is not only about geographical regions, but much more into socio-political context. I wrote a paper together with my colleague from UCL, Pivashigos, on decolonizing transition research. And in that paper, we referred to Global South as a specific socio-political economy that has colonial histories, which mean that this region with colonial histories has diverse epistemology and ontologies which have not been able to secure access to basic services like public transportations for a significant part of the populations. And this context also mentioned how there is specific socio-political characteristic, like for example, ill functioning of institutions that protect the privilege of few while undermining the well-being of many. So the way I discuss about context of Global South in this thesis is in understanding the socio-political context, which I think align with the way we discuss about ride sharing. Indonesia, as a post-colonial country, has not been able to secure basic service for public transport. And in this sense, the innovations of ride sharing somehow happen in this similar context. So I think it's not a question whether or not I'm using the framework from this country or this country, but to what extent when I'm using one particular framework, it gives nuance to understanding the mobility transitions. And those nuance, I think, is pretty much speaking out in this thesis through, as what you say, through giving more foreground to informal workers, informal economy, informal transportations, as well as to the everyday struggles that is happen, and this framework allows me to do so.
Okay, thank you. Then I have a more specific question about Chapter 5. Where you investigate institutional work strategies during COVID by platforms. And I was actually wondering whether these platforms were not already engaging in very similar type of institutional work strategies before Corona hit. And whether then the Corona context was just a matter of kind of rephrasing their existing strategies.
Yes, in Chapter 5, I identified 5 different institutional work, which is framing, like for example, how online taxi was framed as heroes of the pandemic, and then in terms of theorizations, how, for example, they create new concept of doing mobility in times of physical distancing, and also in stimulating collaborations, how this company are collaborating with different sectors to create a safe and healthy protocols for these services, and lobbying, how this drivers community and ride-sharing company are lobbying the governments, and then also on the negotiations. So I think in some part of these strategies, as yes, I also agree that there is a continuation of pre-existing strategies from the company, like doing lobbying and negotiation, but there is also something new that is caused by the crisis, especially because their ride sharing is pretty much a service that is dependent with social interactions, but the crisis did not allow that. So I think that is the new thing that these actors need to mobilize the institutional works in this context.
Okay, but then I still wonder whether these sudden shocks that are often put in the landscape level in transition studies are really kind of accelerating or helping such transitions to unfold, because you don't have the counterfactual, right? What would have happened without COVID? And maybe the strategies that were already employed would have also led to the legitimization of these platforms. So can you reflect on how important are these external shocks in transition processes really?
I have 2 points in answering your question. The first one, I think what I reflect the most is that this crisis does highlight the resiliencies of informal institutions because throughout identifying the institutional work, we can see that these informal workers, informal institutions are fighting back and reclaiming back the way for them to operationalize their services. And
Thank you very much, Professor Franklin. The committee will now withdraw for further deliberation. The session is adjourned. I hereby reopen this session. Please be seated. Madam Doctoral Candidate, this committee, installed by the Board of the Conferral of Doctoral Degrees, has considered your dissertation and has heard your defense. The committee has decided to confer on you the title of Doctor. I now kindly ask the supervisor, Professor Rob Raven, to invest you with the honors in the traditional fashion.
By virtue of the authority conferred on us by law and according to the decision of the Board of the Conferral of Doctoral Degrees present at this session, I hereby confirm upon you, Suki Lestari Ioana, the doctoral degree to which are attached all rights and obligations towards science and society as laid down by law and custom. Do you promise always to perform your duties accordingly to the principle of academic integrity, honestly and scrupulously, difficult word, critically and transparently and independently and impartially?
I promise.
Then I present you with the diploma signed by the rector, supervisors and co-supervisor and bearing the Great Seal of Utrecht University. Congratulations. Well done. For the social media, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to give the floor now to your third promoter, Professor Wouter Boon, to give a short speech.
Yeah. Dear esteemed Dr. Suki Lestari Ioana, I have the privilege of being the first to address you in your capacity as doctor. Of course, I also speak on behalf of your other promoters, Rob, Maarten, and Frans. When reading your acknowledgements, it became clear to me that you approach your thesis as a journey, and what a journey it was. I would like to take the audience gathered here today on this journey, and since your thesis is about ride sharing, I would like to say, let's go for the ride. The journey was first and foremost an intellectual one. You ventured into a research area that had been underexplored, looking at contributions that sharing economy can make to urban sustainability transitions. You stepped into this area studying a context that is in itself underserved by transition studies scholars, the Global South. We heard it today also during the discussion, which highlights distinct roles for big platform companies, governments that want to regulate a sector that is informal in nature, as well as the drivers themselves. You were able to theoretically approach these novel phenomena and navigate methodological challenges, how to engage policymakers, how to survey drivers, and also how to do this during COVID-19, a period that made both doing qualitative research difficult, especially involving respondents who had a hard time making ends meet during the pandemic. You were able to pull this off through a combination of relentless perseverance and a warm personality, really showing that you care for the topic as well as for the people involved in ride sharing. This meant that you were able to engage many stakeholders into workshops and multi-criteria mapping exercises. The warm and engaged personality that you brought to your research is in stark contrast to the three terrifying words in the title of your thesis: contestation, conflict, crisis. The journey you went through was also one of personal development. As you mentioned in the acknowledgements of the thesis, you really saw the PhD project as a way to embrace academic freedom, care and humility. You wanted to develop yourself as an academic researcher as well as a person. You thank us as supervisors for the opportunity to pursue this, but we really also want to express that you have inspired us as well. What really impressed us was that all the way through the various paper projects, you had a clear picture of what the main narrative would be. You really showed your independent way of working and thinking, which relates to the term that you use at the start and at the finish of your acknowledgements, Merdeka, if I pronounce it well. This is a very laudable thing, a thing that you usually do not see from the start as a PhD student. From very early on in the project, you began to address us supervisors as the dream team, but we want to stress that you are very much a valuable member of this dream team. And then the journey really became a personal one as well. Next to working on your thesis, you also enriched your life by moving to the Netherlands for a few years, remaining in contact with many friends and family. And what is more, you're giving birth to and raising 2 children. You really showed the meaning of sharing and combining personal growth with intellectual curiosity. So what a ride it was. At the end of the thesis wrote, "A bright future awaits you with new projects, both at the university and at home. We look forward to staying in touch. Let us all join the celebration soon. Once again, on behalf of your promoters and co-promoters, Rob, Maarten, Frans, congratulations to you, your husband who is at home, Asa, Ray, your family, friends, and all your loved ones."
Thank you very much, Professor Boon. Before I close this session, I would like to give the opportunity to Professor Kirana Jaya to congratulate you. He is online. Please, Professor Jaya.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to congratulate the new PhD and focus on ride sharing in Indonesia. As advisory Minister Transportasi, we also very grateful for you, especially to improve our policy. You start with the institutional void, and then you jump to improve the institution ride sharing in Indonesia. Whatever is still dysfunctional right now, but at least your working is very useful for our government as well. Thank you, the usual Utrecht. Thank you, Professor. Thank you all of the. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Professor Jaya. Very learned madam, on behalf of the board of the Conferral of Doctoral Degrees, I congratulate you on the honors which have been bestowed on you. I hereby conclude this session.
Of course.